All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. I am very excited because we're going to be returning to at least once a week members content as I had promised on last week's post. And each week it's going to be something a little different. Sometimes it might be a paper, other times it might be a recording, but I felt that it was very necessary today to discuss the very intricate notions of high voltage plasma fields, the fourth state of matter, and how that in fact interacts with the metaphysical. To do that, I have actually brought with me today, I have here with me rather, Miranda Ray from Golden Thread Healing Arts, and we're going to be having a discussion in particular pertaining to some of the content that we're going to be examining right here, right now, pertaining to a few different topics that will be able to stimulate and transition into both the physical and the metaphysical world. And one of those has to do with something called the Ebner effect. Now, what's interesting about this effect in particular is that first off, I want to say that I was not the first one to find this. A very grateful, gracious, and honorable member of our Patreon actually did found this information for us, and essentially it deals with the notion of a primeval code that reactivates various archetypes of plants and blueprints. That would allow them to essentially re-stimulate themselves or have certain neural nodes and other forms within their network that would allow them to essentially remember their past forms of not just activity, but their past forms of living in the sense of the state that they were in. Now, some of you may say, Dave, this reminds me a lot of the cancer concept of using time-reversed phase conjugate waves to sort of help take one person's cancerous cell and revert it back to a much healthier cell. And to that, I would say, indeed, that is the case. But one thing that I find very interesting relating to all of this is the notion that when we look at the way in which holography, morphogenic fields work in correspondence with voltage potentials and the ether in the vacuum itself, we actually end up coming back to a state of pure consciousness. I know we've talked in the group Zoom calls for members about consciousness and many other things. However, one thing I find interesting, and one of the reasons I wanted to bring Miranda in on this recording, was because when we look at the notion of 4D Minkowski space and 5D anti-de Sitter space, although personally I would argue that actually we live in a de Sitter space. Anti-de Sitter space is when we start creating negative energy and gradients in the vacuum, but that's for a different conversation. We find here again, time and space are inherently intertwined, in addition to having extra dimensions to them. Now, in my line of work, this is what we would call a third, fourth, fifth time derivative or temporal derivative. But in Miranda's line of work, one thing that I'll let her explain is that this visual in particular is something that she has been able to relate to in her own sessions of when it comes to channeling and helping others. Now, if you'd like Miranda to explain what you were telling me before about what you can see and relate to in this particular image.
So in this particular image, I can see and relate to the black, I guess you'd call them like ovals or circles. To me, each one of those is a particular point at which I would reach in a session, and I would be given one of these little red dots, and I would see that as almost like a node or a piece of information or a nugget of information, if you will. And each time that we go deeper and asking more and more in a session, we are brought down to another layer, another ring, and receive more and more nodes. So by the time that we've reached a certain particular part within a session, we have all these different red dots or these node points that help us connect information in order to put together, quote unquote, the puzzle of what's going on with the person in their energetic field. And what's interesting is that these red dots, these nodes or these nuggets of information are often in different points in time. So they can be past, they can be present, they can also be what we would call multidimensional or future, if you will.
That's very interesting because to me, when I look at this, this represents to me an electrical network. And I say that because there was a previous website that I was actually going to use regarding the Ebner effect, but it has since been taken down. However, what we see here is that these are some screenshots from 1990s European documentary showing in the laboratory the regeneration of not just animal limbs and whatnot, but plant life that was able to regenerate in a way that it hasn't, or excuse me, not regenerate, but re-inhabit characteristics and archetypes, and therefore physical blueprints of itself that it hadn't in hundreds, if not thousands of years. Now we see, of course, this website is not an English website, but the point being is that this notion that neural networks, or excuse me, electrical networks allow for extremely high voltage under various conditions to permit previous forms of its past, we could say, memory state or state of existence to then be brought into the present under the notion that time itself is not linear. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that I find from this paper, and I will show the title of this paper in a moment. I think it makes it more exciting if I read it first and then show. We see here, as detailed by Teodorani and a handful of others, plasmas can form complex lifelike shapes as well as nucleus that may acquire DNA-like capabilities. For example, space is permeated by dust, and when a plasma incorporates dust grains, the plasma acquires an electric charge that sucks in electrons, which attract positively charged ions, giving rise to plasma crystals, which also contain organic matter, including fragments of carbonaceous chondrites. Now, in particular here, we see that, and I quote, electrostatic forces and the polarization of the plasma cause these plasma dust crystals to twist, spin, and form helical structures that can evolve into a double helix, similar to the double helix of DNA. Teodorani argues that these helixes can then be replicated in other crystals, and that the self-organizing ability of these crystals can affect other plasmas, which may also form a plasma dust crystal helix. Another, although theoretical, this exchange of electrical charges could be likened to horizontal gene transfer. However, there's no evidence plasmas contain DNA, nucleotides, or amino acids. Now, this is the part I wanted to focus on. There is no evidence. Now, what's interesting is that one can argue a form of evidence may, in fact, be exhibited within your line of work, specifically. Going back directly to this concept of what you were talking about as these different points in which you are brought in during your channeling sessions to then go layers deeper. Now, what's interesting about this is that I wanted to point out, if we go to the very top and we see that this was published in Scientific Research Publishing, Journal of Modern Physics, highly respected peer-reviewed journal, extraterrestrial life in the thermosphere, plasmas, UAP, pre-life, fourth state of matter, and we see not that these days, as you know, with respect to those that have degrees and whatnot, we see that that's kind of not being as prevalent today. However, we see the credibility and the position in which these individuals hold in their various respective universities, but are willing to discuss this nonetheless. Now, what's interesting is that they bring up things like, for example, the NASA tether and all that. However, we have to ask ourselves, when we look at things like the Ebner effect and the way in which voltage creates this sort of field of potentials within the ether that can then be twisted and turned into different lattice structures that would encompass different forms of life and whatnot. I have to ask you, Miranda, do you find that this in fact has a correlation to what you do when it comes to channeling, healing, hypnotherapy, etc., at a conscious level that is not exhibited physically, but is evident in the result of your clients and how they feel after your session?
Absolutely. First thing that you keep touching on is the word blueprint. And so one of the things that comes up often is when there is healing to be done on the energetic level and we get to a particular part in the session, there is often a point in which they say we are returning this person to their original blueprint, meaning they are removing something, and they often add in light or color. And sometimes there is sacred geometry involved in this. And then we find that there is even a correlation between what happens when we work in the upper chakras, specifically the crown and the third eye. We come to a point where they often will say that we are pulling out connections, and they are talking about neural connections. Sometimes these neural connections come forth as a rumination or a thought process that's very destructive for the person. And oftentimes they will come in and they will add light to particular areas, and it literally is creating new neural pathways, so new neural connections. So this to me is an example of neuroplasticity in a way, and returning the person to their original quote unquote divine blueprint.
Now, speaking of which, you've mentioned to me before that when you see these, when you are essentially working in your sessions and you see these different, we could say, could we call them nodal points, so to speak?
Node points.
Node points. Do you find that there are more penetrable node points than there are compared to other node points in people?
I believe that there are. What's interesting is that in the sessions, we only work on what the client is ready to absorb or to integrate. So there may be other node points that are worked on at a later time in a different session, just simply because there are layers of things that need to be removed first. So we work with what I would call the primary node points. And then once that has been integrated, if they choose to go further, or if there's something else that needs to be done, then there are other node points that are related to the original first layer node points.
Do you think that do you end up seeing it, what people call light codes as well?
Yes.
And do you see stacks of them or not?
Everything I see in stacks, I'll put it that way.
So everything you can relate back to this kind of geometry?
Yes, if we look at the exploration during the session, and I call it the exploration because it literally is exploratory. You're being very much like an investigator. You're looking at the original reason why the person is coming to you, whether it's illness, whether it's, emotional, whether it's an addiction, whether it's just a general dis-ease. We start with that and then work our way through each one of these. So each one of them is a layer of information that we're gathering to get these node points in order to figure out how we need to fix it completely.
Now, I want to mention as well to that point is that when we look at the word electrostatic, I wanted to mention for the audience, I think that's a bit of a misnomer, the same way that the term anti-gravity is. And I say that because electrostatic resembles this notion that when we think of the word static, we think of still. It is only still on the surface. And what I mean by that is a given cell or a given organism. But underneath it are all of these other double helix-like structures or circular structures, toroidal structures, donut-like structures that are not static, but we can say, we can use the word static, but we could say quasi-static, in which they inhabit different multi-directional potentials that they could go in. And I say that because if we look here, the primeval code, according to rexresearch.com, in primeval code reactivated, living archetypes of plants and animals created at the laboratory. In lab experiments, the researchers, Dr. Guido Ebner and Heinz Schirk, I probably butchered that, exposed cereal seeds and fish eggs to a, quote, electrostatic field. In other words, a high voltage field in which no current flows. Unexpectedly, primeval organisms grew out of these seeds and eggs, a fern that no botanist was able to identify. Primeval corn with up to 12 ears per stalk, wheat that was ready to be harvested in just 4 to 6 weeks, and giant trout extinct in Europe for 130 years with so-called salmon hooks. It was as if these organisms accessed their own genetic memories on command in the electric field. Now, I think what's interesting about this is that we can make the correlation between electricity and the metaphysical, the same way that we're able to examine the way in which a lot of these other plasma beings seem to exist within the ionosphere, but also within the thermosphere. These are some still images from the 1990s NASA electrified satellite tether that was approached by plasmas after the tether broke. And these academics, by the way, have ruled out that all in any of these, we could say, unidentified anomalies were not space dust or anything of this nature. For those that were not familiar, NASA basically launched what they called a tether, which we can see here, that dealt with, I don't know the exact details of the experiment, but essentially it dealt with basically charged ions and high voltage, and the tether broke. After the tether broke, there was a vast amount of high voltage that was dissipated into the local field around the tether. And then we saw all of a sudden the voltage brought up and was made, what permitted the observability of these type of plasma-like forms. Now, I'm not saying they were all plasma, although quite many of them seem to be, and they were pulsating as if they were alive and so on and so forth. Now, I can't help but relate this to and reconcile the possibility that there may be different forms of life that may be not as intelligent as us, and then other forms of life that would be substantially more intelligent than us. And we could see perhaps a little glimpse of that in these still images from the pulsating plasmas. Now, I have to ask, Miranda, do you think that there's an interaction, if we consider the soul potentially as a composition of a Bose-Einstein condensate, which would be the next phase past plasma, do you think that during various sessions of hypnotherapy, channeling, and so on, we can have these plasmas exist around us, but in a very vortex or toroidal-like notion that we as natural electric transducers, meaning emitters and receivers, could not just inhabit but project, especially when interacting with other individuals?
Absolutely. I think one perfect example of that is being when people are able to see someone's auric field. They're able to see different colors, which means that they're able to see different frequencies, and they're seeing that person's energetic field outside of their physical body.
Right.
So I think when the conditions are right, absolutely.
Right. I couldn't agree more. We see here that just to quickly show for everyone here, all other explanations ruled out, not wreckage, not debris, not ice. So for those that may think that there may have been any of that in this particular case with NASA, then then make of that as you will. But we see now, going to the Ebner effect, this same type of notion now being exhibited, in which it was under controlled laboratory settings and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting about this is that after Guido Ebner and Heinz Schurk both passed away unexpectedly, ironically enough, in 2001, their experiments were continued by Guido Ebner's son, Daniel, himself a biologist. On a private basis, Daniel Ebner, studies of biology, chemistry, and biostatics at the University of Basel in Montreal, works as management consultant at the Swiss Arcondis company, Art of Consulting and Development for Information Systems, and essentially showed that he was going to present some of these facts back in 2008. Now, as to what happened to such a presentation is interesting to see, because if we click on this link here.
Between oat milk and almond milk, which should I drink?
Neither. This is a protein drink. You've got almond.
So we see the presentation of the before and after effects. And I can't help but think that when we look at the core infrastructure of the archetype within plants and the blueprint within plants, we think of things, for example, as the mycelium network and so on and so forth. And I wonder to what extent you or others in your field have spoken to others that have been able to basically feel/see through their third eye this notion of some type of network, not just a neural network or an electrical network, but a network of pathways that would basically make this network look very minuscule and childlike compared to the other networks that you've seen. Are you familiar with any grand level type networks? Very too much to fathom in a physical sense?
I know I've been shown an example of, the giant network of everything being interconnected. And it very much is like, the best way to describe what I've seen is very much like a spider web of everything being so very connected. And the one thing that they wanted to show me in that particular session was that the slightest bit of movement or change in one particular area has a ripple effect around the spider web or the network that we would consider.
Very interesting. That's very interesting. Now, another thing that I find very peculiar about all of this is, of course, we see still images from the documentary and whatnot, but I find it very interesting for those that are more interested into the technical hardware side of things. When you, for example, are looking, if you have, say, a lead acid or a sulfide battery or what have you, this is not well known, but inducing just purely high voltage pulses into these batteries actually help dissipate some of the ionic charge within them and help dissipate some of the chemical stickiness that normally sticks to the bottom of a battery when it's been emptied or it hasn't been used for a long time or it's been in use for a long time. So we see that high voltage pulses, although yes, admittedly can be dangerous to human beings if done under the right conditions in such a way that it does not shock us while we're inducing these processes, can in fact not only help bring back the memory of these different types of plants, but they also help, again, not recharge, but clean and purify the internal aspects of various batteries. And I'm not the first one to bring that up. If for those that would like to look into it, John Bedini himself has actually mentioned this before. But I find the way in which the electrical structure, when current is then applied with these voltages in relation to the network that is allegedly existing around us, how strongly it connects to the different aspects of intuition, hypnotherapy, and all of these other different types of practices that that our ancestors were much more well versed in than we are today. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
I'm really, really glad that you brought up ancestors, because one particular traditional belief, and you can look more into this, but the Lakota tribes were very, very connected to the earth, the oil, or to the soil. They were also very connected to the stars. And they had extreme knowledge about consciousness. And again, it was written in their form of understanding. So a lot of it has metaphorical meanings held within nature. But there are several different manuals, or I believe they're called the star manuals. And they talk about how interconnected the cosmos is with actual people or living things, animals, plants, the earth, and how they're all alive and they're very interconnected. So again, I could get you a link if you want to look at the star manuals, but I think they're from the Lakota Nation, or the Lakota people.
Now, this is interesting because we talk about, and we'll probably wrap up with this, but we talk about the notion of light codes. And is it true that light codes are normally seen in the sky or in high altitudes?
I mean, I see them in sessions, so,
Okay.
you know, it's interesting because they're not, again, some people might call it light language, but they are very much symbols, and they're different geometric shapes. Sometimes it's sacred geometry. And the way that it shows up in a session is it's written in light. And there's different frequencies, and it's interesting because each color has a different frequency, and it also usually has an emotion. Sometimes there's not always an English word that I'm aware of to interpret. So I have to give a much longer explanation of to why I'm seeing this particular color, this pattern, or this shape.
Right.
It's also interesting sometimes that the light codes look, again, some of them look a little bit Sumerian, or again, like hieroglyphs in a way.
Babylonian, Sumerian kind of.
Yeah, very, very Sumerian in nature looking. And again, so each one is very, very different.
Now, I find this interesting because when we look at the fact that, to what you just said, when we look at the way in which there are these different forms of energy that tend to ebb and flow, as we know, we notice that in relation to trying to connect the physical concept with a metaphysical, we notice that, again, Bose-Einstein condensates, plasmas, and so on seem to be definitely an existing state of matter, but it is also not rigid. And I say that because we look here and we see that astronauts have observed these plasma-like structures engaging in complex behaviors, including approaching space shuttles and experimental satellites generating electromagnetic activity, and have described them, these astronauts have, as, quote, definitely not rigid and, quote, not a solid metal structure, oval-shaped like a series of ellipses, end quote. And yet they have metallic coloration, according to eyewitness reports by astronauts, possibly silver, which might also account for any reflective properties. I find this interesting because we see the properties of light and plasma interacting in the thermosphere, and then as it works its way into the ionosphere, people have claimed to have observed light codes when looking into the sky, and then brought all the way down into the notion of a channeling session, which seems to be, again, a concept relating back to this type of sort of stepping stair or stepping ladder type notion of these different nodes that you can sort of hop in and out of. So if we were to view the top node as sort of the upper part of the planet in a fractal sense, and then we worked our way down, and not necessarily purely physically, but in a metaphysical and physical combination, and we worked our way down, we see the different layers in which occur that are fractal in nature, but extend past various. We could see here the first loop is just a normal elliptic loop. The second one's a little longer. The third one is a little longer. Looks like it has a pulse-like geometry that occurs. So you give that pulse and then it emits itself in this elliptic notion. And then it gets strong enough such that it separates itself from the initial curve. And then it moves away farther and then farther and then farther. This exact diagram seems to be very similar to what we were seeing in this paper here with regards to the way the plasmas interacted with the electromagnetic satellites. So did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was gonna say one more thing. As you were reading some of this about what astronauts were seeing, I wanted to just bring up something that is very typical in a session when light codes or even intuitive information, whether it's an object that they're showing me, a place, or even a being, if we want to call it that. It's almost as if the light gathers to create the shape or the formation. And then
Right.
when I ask in the session, okay, tell me more, it will dissipate and then another thing will come in. So it's almost like it is a plasma type,
Right,
if you want to call it that, that creates a shape or a form
right.
and then dissipates once I get that. And then another thing comes in and they form again into something different.
Got you. Wow.
So
Yeah, they form into something different from the initial structure that they were.
right. So let's say that they gave me one particular piece of sacred geometry or a light code in the shape of like a couple of triangles or something
Right.
like that. Once I have that clear image, then I'm asking, okay, show me more, tell me more about this. Why is this here? And then the shape will dissipate and it will be in this black void or this nothingness. And then the light will come back together and create another shape or another picture, another image. So
Is there any of its base form that's kept, or is it completely transformed?
completely transformed.
Interesting. Okay. Interesting. Well, we see here as well much more evidence. We're not going to go through this entire paper that discusses this. We will leave this paper in the description of the video for those that are interested. But we see as well one more case in which we see the way in which these plasma-like beings correspond similarly to the behavior of more metaphysical occurrences, such as what Miranda mentioned in relation to, quote, the best way I can describe it is as some kind of reflective cloth, some type of metallic looking type of cloth, a structure which is definitely not rigid. It's not a solid metal structure, and end quote. But we also see here that the STS-115 reported and filmed a similar encounter, the commander describing them as translucent, flexible, not a solid object, metallic, but not made of metal, and giving off light and glowing. Would you that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought this one up today and we're talking about this because it is translucent. It's very fluid and flexible. And I think that's
Right.
what's interesting to note about this. And again, they will show me an image based in light that is what we would consider like looking like a solid object, a 3D image, so I can see all the way around it.
Right.
But once the image has been conveyed, then it's okay, well, what's the next piece of information? Then it all kind of dissipates and everything goes black, and then another image comes in and they start to form.
And they start to form. Interesting, because some of the description here for those more interested on the physical side is actually very starkly similar in terms of the way that these plasma beings were described as being metallic, but also non-metallic at the same time, is starkly similar to Otis T. Carr's notebooks when he invented many years ago, I believe in the 1930s, the notion of various rotating metals that eventually, after they hit something like 80,000 RPM, would actually become very jello-like in nature in such a way that that normal aluminum was able to actually inhabit some of these properties, which again speaks to the notion of the concept of what we call rotational gravitation and so on and so forth. But I want to point out just one last thing that I find quite ironic and interesting, which is that when we look at the different reportings, again, reported by these very credible people who wrote this paper, we see here, and I quote, that there was an astronaut in space for NASA that saw some of these plasma-like objects, and NASA dismissed the sightings as just reflections. However, the commander disagreed, and he said, quote, "I'm looking out in front of the orbiter. No, there are 3 objects. The one down at the bottom is one we initially saw. It started over window 8, then quickly moved toward the upper windows. We tracked it through windows 1, 2, 3, 4, and now it's outside window 5 and it's moving away," end quote. And then mission control changed the subject. And there are 3 different references to this exact event, which many of the videos are graciously still on YouTube. However, it's very interesting that these plasmas seem to behave as if they're in some type of dielectric medium of some sort. And when high voltage is applied, they're able to become maybe not more excited, or maybe that is the case, but at least more observable to us. through the means and filters in which we have to observe them. And I find it very interesting that through the physical means that we've observed them, they're also, this behavior is starkly similar to the metaphysical and spiritual means in which they seem to behave as well in your line of work. So if there's anything that you wanted to leave everyone with as we wrap up this episode, I hope that everyone here is able to grasp a much more coherent connection between these plasmas and the way in which the metaphysical connects with the physical. Would you like to leave anyone with any extra thoughts or?
Yeah, I guess the one thing is, being open and being curious about what you may or may not be able to observe with the naked eye. Science and spirituality truly do go hand in hand. And I think as we understand more about the science, our level of understanding about the spiritual part of it will meet itself.
One more question. Would you say dissolving the ego in a person is equivalent to applying voltage to
Absolutely.
these plants in which they gain back their former structures that they couldn't otherwise gain?
If the ego is in the way, which in some cases, I don't necessarily look at it as the ego as it is interference, something that is not of natural origin, we'll put it that way, or not of its natural structure, I guess is another way to look at it, then it does block the ability to achieve these different levels of understanding. So
these different layers.
Right. So
Yeah.
if you're trying to access this first ellipses here, and you're trying to reach let's say you get 2 or 3 of these red dots or these nodes, these points of what I call points of information, points of receiving. If there is bias, if there is ego, then it is much harder to get down to these levels.
Got you. Well, that was very, very valuable insight. I really appreciate that. And I figured that I would bring Miranda in on this because there's only so much that I can dive into as it pertains to the physical aspect of all of this. And so there's a lot more that we can discuss. For those interested in the links, of course, that are the members, we will be happy to provide them. For those that are going to be seeing this later on publicly on YouTube, please feel free to check out the Patreon, and we will catch all of you very, very soon. Thank you.